Well, good morning, Village. It is such a privilege to be able to deliver God's word to you this morning. We want to talk this morning about human relationships, especially families. Families can be wonderful, especially within families or kin. Just as we're listening to the video where they're talking about the Yakima Nation and just how that kinship, that family togetherness is so important and so vital for relationships. And by kin, I'm not just referring necessarily to people with whom you are biologically related, but also friends who become like family to you. It's kind of like a DNA group, wouldn't you say? These family members can be self-giving and sacrificial, willing to forfeit their own preferences for the good and welfare of their family, of other people. Even in tragedies and disasters that we hear about, there are stories of families, of those people who are like family members who are so dependable in those situations. It's like that person you know that you can call when you need someone to just listen. Someone that actively listens when you can unload those things that are happening in your life without fear of being judged or put down. Or maybe it's that person who's always an encourager. We need those people that even on our worst days, our toughest situations, they don't just offer platitudes saying, well, things will get better tomorrow. Instead, their clear-eyed faith and resilience are infectious. They're comforting. At times when we're struggling to see God act in a situation, they are there all the time. Maybe that person who's there to help you when you're worn out after caring for a family member. They show up at your door at some early morning hour with a smile, maybe groceries or a meal, or just that reassuring touch that soothes your spirit, that lifts your spirit. Maybe it's that person you know who has a pickup truck and is willing not just to help you move that sleeper sofa, but actually move it up to the second floor of your home. That's a job. There's someone like this here this morning that I remember someone in the congregation had car trouble in Seattle. And this person drove from Portland to Seattle to pick them up and then bring them back to Portland without being asked just because they were a friend. These are bonds of support and caring that are so deeply nourishing spiritually, emotionally, physically. And this is what our community is being transformed to demonstrate. Not always perfectly, but being conformed into the likeness of the image of Christ in our character and our actions. On the other hand, sometimes there are deep wounds that can occur in families. These emotional injuries are frequently unintentional and sometimes done with the best of intentions. My wife Angie is not here this morning. I can tell a story about early on when we were first married, our first year of marriage. We'd invited the pastor of our church and his wife to our apartment for dinner. And wanting to relieve my bride of all the chores of cooking and cleaning, I said, well, I can help make the lasagna. I found what I thought was a great recipe. It didn't require boiling the lasagna noodles before you baked the lasagna. Sound like a time-saving recipe? What could go wrong? So, somehow I missed the note in the recipe that to compensate for not pre-cooking the lasagna noodles, you should add extra sauce to the lasagna before you bake it. That was the crunchiest lasagna we ever had. I was so afraid that our guests would chip a tooth while eating it. It's true we can pick our friends, but family doesn't always come with that option. The life of Jacob is a great example. He's the continuation of God's story of redemption of his creation. Pastor Paul led us through Genesis 1 through 11 with an alternative imagination to the violence of the world, how we, rather than trying to build up towers of empire so we can dig down to provide wells that nourish others. And Pastor Pete shared how it was Abraham who chose to trust God when God called him to make the sacrifice of his son, which seemed absolutely contrary to the plan of blessing and shalom for the world. Pastor Insel last week reminded us of the life of Isaac, that life doesn't just happen to us, but the inheritance is a blessing to be shared and expanded. As we look now at this second generation of Abraham's descendants, we observe a continuation and intensification of a cycle that began in the Garden of Eden. You see, remember back in the garden, first there's a creation and blessing as God brings out of chaos order and life. We see key words like life, create, establish, seed, grow, fruit, and fruitfulness. Then there's a test as God sovereignly chooses a human partner to share in this creation of life and blessing. But we've seen each time the human partner fails due to deception. It leads to division and results in violence. And subsequent human generations only intensify this cycle of facing a test, failing, resulting in deeper deception, division, and violence. And then one line, a person, a family is chosen by God to begin a new movement of recreation, often involving God establishing a new covenant with that individual. So despite human failures, God remains committed to moving forward his purpose of restoring and bringing blessing to his creation. A new future that extends to all of life and is used by God to advance his plan to redeem the world. And yet, despite these failings of humans, God still chooses the most unlikely individuals to carry out his purposes. If we were writing the story, they likely wouldn't be our first choice as the main character in the plot. But we find the Bible, isn't it so authentic in depicting human nature? It shows the foibles of the people God chooses to bless and then continues to unfold his plan on full display using those people. He chooses to bless them, and Jacob is one of the most unlikely of those that God chooses. The lead character for God's redemptive plan within his generation. Unlike his grandfather, Abraham, Jacob's life did not always exhibit a deep and abiding faith in God's promises, nor was he willing to follow God's plan even when it seemed difficult. Rather, Jacob lived a life that was often characterized by conniving, deceit, craftiness, and opportunism. So often in his life, Jacob lived as if securing God's promised blessings depended entirely on his own efforts. And if we're honest, I know I can see that same tendency in myself. But let's delve into this story together. Would you join me in prayer? Lord and sovereign God, this morning we ask you open our eyes to see anew the wonder of who you are. Your call of blessing and restoration in the world that moves forward today. May we see even more clearly how you're still transforming brokenness into wholeness, self-sufficiency into dependence, and in all of this, grasp your faithfulness to fulfill your purposes. Amen. In order to comprehend the story of God's people in the Old Testament, it's essential to understand Jacob and his character. You see, it's because the portrayal of Jacob, the portrayal of the children of Israel reflects the story of Jacob. You see, Jacob is revealed to be deceptive, a trickster, which results in his departure or exile from the land of Canaan. But God also orchestrates an eventual return of Jacob to the land. And that's the same story that is paralleled in the children of Israel. Jacob's name means heel in Hebrew, or usurper. And while his second name, Israel, means struggle with God, the story of Jacob, while filled with trickery and deception, exile and return, also describes his conflict not just with other humans, but also with God. Jacob wrestled to believe the promises of God and God's plan for him and for the world. The writers of the Old Testament later used Jacob's story to represent not only the nation of Israel's corruption, but also to serve as a source for a hopeful future and a return from exile, just as God had done for Jacob. One of the many examples of this is found in Isaiah, where the prophet writes, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend, I took you from the ends of the earth, from its farthest corners, I called you. I said, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not rejected you. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Isaiah uses this story of Jacob's exile from Canaan and return as a model for the confident hope of the current generation of Israelites who were in exile and praying for a return to the land of their ancestors. The story of Jacob demonstrates how they could trust God who had not abandoned them to exile. God would return them to the land just as he had their forefathers. When Isaac and Rebekah were first married, they were unable to have children. But as Isaac prayed for his wife for over 19 years, God removed their barrenness and Rebekah conceived. You'd think that's the end of the story, happy ending, but somehow she discovered that her pregnancy was not at all what she expected. She was experiencing a struggle in her womb, and she went to seek God for an answer. God provided this oracle that's recorded in Genesis that says, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." God was foretelling that two nations are being formed within Rebekah, and each was struggling for supremacy. And yet, even before the twins were born, God sovereignly chose the supposed younger and weaker infant to bring about his purposes and plans. Ultimately, the younger would rule over the older. This is found in Malachi, the first chapter, where God states, "Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord. Yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated." What did God mean by that? He wasn't talking about his emotional response to each of the brothers. He had no aversion to Esau. But this is his statement that God divinely chose Jacob to be in covenant relationship with Yahweh. It is Yahweh's, God's sovereign plan of grace, and it wasn't based on the merit of the individual. And haven't we seen God demonstrate this in other places in Genesis? We remember that God chose and accepted the offering of the younger Abel, but rejected the offering of the older and stronger Cain. The line of Seth, the younger brother, became the chosen lineage for blessing and salvation. And Isaac, the younger, was chosen over the older brother, Ishmael. So we see God extending blessing to those who had no claim to it, and these individuals received favor they had not earned or deserved. It was all due to the goodness of God's purpose to bless his creation. So, back to Jacob, even from the time of birth, he has these recurring struggles and conflicts. When Rebekah gave birth to the twins, the younger Jacob came down her birth canal, sliding, grasping the heel of Esau, almost trying to elbow him out of the way so Jacob could be first. He was willing to use, it seemed, any means necessary to be number one. Conflict within families. Doesn't that make us recall the conflict between Cain and Abel that resulted in Cain killing his brother, or the sons of Noah who parted after the flood? Also, Abraham and Lot separated because the land of Canaan could not support both of their herds. Well, as they grew up, we see that Esau became an outdoorsman, a sportsman, a hunter. Whereas Jacob was quieter and more contemplated, the Hebrew noun used to describe Jacob is frequently translated into English as quiet. But there's an alternative translation that may better describe someone who is organized, calculating, or shrewd. That seems to encapsulate Jacob. Later in the story, when Esau returns from a hunting expedition, exhausted, famished, he asked Jacob for a bowl of stew that Jacob was cooking. Jacob, being that shrewd negotiator, tells his brother, "Sure, you can have some stew, just sell me your birthright." The birthright usually went to the firstborn male in a household, and it provided positions of leadership, and also a double portion of the inheritance was passed along to the son with the birthright. So shrewd, calculating Jacob saw a chance to make up for not being able to be born first, and he wanted to snatch that inheritance that he thought he deserved. The text doesn't explicitly state it, but the way Jacob so quickly negotiated for that birthright suggests to me that ambitious Jacob had been thinking about this for a while. He was just looking for the right opportunity to execute his plan. And of course, later, Jacob goes further. In a bold move, collaborating with his mother, he decides to deceive his father Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing that Isaac intended to give to Esau. Jacob was a shrewd and calculating man. He knew how to make the deals that would put him where he wanted to be and thought he deserved to be. His motto seemed to be, if it's going to be, it's up to me. And if it requires deceiving his father and brother to steal this blessing, well, it's just business. But as we look more closely at Isaac's blessing of Jacob, we see in that blessing reflections of both the blessings bestowed in the Garden of Eden and God's blessing of Abraham. Isaac bestows on Jacob the blessings of fertility and abundance, as well as rulership over others, echoing the blessings God gave to humanity in the Garden of Eden. And there's also a blessing of protection, which God had previously promised to Abraham. We see here where Jacob receives the blessing from Isaac. Look, the smell of my son, the smell of a field that Yahweh has blessed. May Yahweh give you from the dew of the skies and from the fatness of the land and much grain and fresh wine. And so these are images. The dew of the skies was that water that almost magically appeared. It was a gift of the skies to water the earth. The fat of the land was the most valuable produce that was created. And grain and fresh wine were the best of that produce. Isaac goes on to bless Jacob. May people serve you, and may people groups bow down to you. Be more mighty than your brother, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. And we think back to the Garden of Eden where God, Elohim, says he blessed them. He said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the land and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea. And then finally, Isaac says, those who curse you are cursed, and those who bless you are blessed. And God had told Abraham, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, will make your name great, so you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well, when Esau learned of this deception by his brother, he reacted with lethal fury. Although Isaac realized at this point of Jacob's deceit in gaining this blessing, Isaac also recognized that this blessing was still irrevocable. Isaac said, I blessed him. Indeed, he will be blessed. Esau at this time made up his mind that once their father died, he would kill Jacob. So Jacob, fearing his brother's wrath, flees from the land, going into exile back to his mother's home in Haran. He would hopefully find a wife there and stay long enough that Esau's temper will kind of be assuaged as he forgets about the stolen blessing. He's hopefully would be there just a few days. We look at this recording of Jacob's life, and it has a chiastic literary structure. Michael Fishbane, a Hebrew Bible scholar, has arranged it in a helpful way. First, there's the deception to gain the blessing, the barakah, that's stolen. Then there's a fear of Esau, which leads to a flight from the land. Then as Jacob flees into exile, he has an encounter, a most unusual encounter with God, in which God, as Jacob is fleeing from Canaan and fleeing from his brother Esau, God promises the Abrahamic covenantal blessing to Jacob. God meets him. He says, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you're lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and to the south. All peoples of the earth will be blessed through you and your offsprings. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done everything I have promised you. So during Jacob's departure, God makes a tremendous promise of blessing. Jacob's seed will return to the land, and there will be a future blessing of all the people of the earth. God promises to give Jacob and his descendants the land on which Jacob is staying, to multiply his descendants so they cannot be counted, and to bless all of the people of the earth through them. And then God said he would never leave Jacob until he fulfilled everything that he promised him. Well, what was Jacob's response? Which is interesting after God has made this unilateral obligation to him. Jacob says, well, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I'm taking, and implied, if he will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, and so that if I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you will give me, I will give a tenth. So we see that Jacob takes in God's promise of abundant blessing, and he narrows God's gift of an unconditional unilateral promise into a conditional transaction. He shrinks the scope down to just his own personal needs of food, clothing, and protection. Walter Brueggemann captures this well when he says, Jacob's response strikes one as a genuine act of faith. But Jacob will be Jacob. Even in this solemn moment, he still sounds like a bargain hunter. He still adds an if. Jacob attempts to seal this transaction with God by promising to share a small part of his gain and also to build a temple for God, which God had not asked for. So once Jacob travels on a rise in Haran, we remember that Jacob meets Rachel, his cousin, also Rachel's sister is Leah, and of course that famous uncle Laban. We see the irony of this. Jacob says that he tells his uncle Laban that he will work 7 years for the hand of Rachel. But remember the story that on the wedding night, Uncle Laban plays the switcheroo. Jacob thinks it's Rachel is coming into his tent, but it's actually Leah. And isn't that just irony that the same deception that Jacob had done on his father Isaac, Uncle Laban now does on Jacob? We see in a condition of poor eyesight or darkness, the younger sibling was switched for the firstborn. Jacob's wages of 7 years of labor to Uncle Laban were deceptive, as the older daughter, Leah, is substituted for the younger. We move to see that there is conflict in Jacob's house as Rachel is loved, the favored wife, but she is barren, while Leah is fertile, but she's unloved. But through God's grace, Rachel also moves from barrenness to fertility and gives birth to Joseph. And the fertility is extended by God not just to his family, but also to his flocks, as Jacob becomes rich. And while Jacob believed that his own ingenuity and elaborate scheming that outsmarted his uncle Laban, resulting in great wealth through the flocks that were produced, in fact, it was God working as he had previously promised to bless Jacob, despite his character. But as Jacob becomes more and more wealthy and his flock increases and Laban's decreases, Uncle Laban becomes increasingly angry and jealous of Jacob's wealth. At the same time, the Lord speaks to Jacob in a dream and tells him to return to the land of his ancestors. So Jacob beats out in haste to return from exile back to Canaan. But we recall that he's pursued by Laban, who encounters Jacob at the border of Canaan. It's also there that Laban contends that Jacob had deceived him and separated from him the rightful wages of his daughters, grandchildren, and flocks and herds. But God had warned Laban not to contend with Jacob. So also at that point, Jacob encounters another sacred place near the border of Canaan. So just as departing into exile, Jacob had an encounter with God. As he returns from exile back to the land of Canaan, he has another vision and encounter with God. And then Jacob prays and reminds God of his promises. He asks him to save him and wrestles with God in prayer. We saw that night he had taken his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and 11 sons and sent them across the ford of the Jabbok. And then he stayed alone and wrestled. And what's interesting about this, it wasn't that Jacob wrestled with God, it's that God wrestled with Jacob. He engaged him. Finally, Jacob, when he could not overcome this man he was wrestling with all night, he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. The man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed them. You see, this was not a boxing match where you're sparring across a ring. This is a wrestling match with Jacob clinging and embracing. He's wrestling with doubt while clinging to God's promises to be with him. He demands a blessing from God. You know, what happens when a person wrestles with God during the dark night of your soul? When you know you can't win, you can't break through that fear and uncertainty. Your pride, your independence, your security, your areas that you thought were your greatest strength are revealed to be inadequate. How have you been broken? What parts of your strength have to be sacrificed in order to truly cling to God in dependence? God transformed Jacob in that wrestling. By being broken, he was transformed and nurtured, matured, as God remakes Jacob for his purposes. He becomes blessed to be a blessing to others. Blessed to be a blessing to others in his household. Blessed to be a blessing into the people surrounding. And we will see that he's blessed. This finds its greatest demonstration in the next generation. So stay tuned. The nature of Jacob's prevailing with God was simply that he held on to God while God weakened him and brought about him a spirit of submission, self-distrust rather than trusting himself. He had desired God's blessing so much that he clung to God throughout this painful humbling. He became low enough for God to raise him up, speaking peace to him and assuring him that he did not need to fear his brother Esau anymore. You know, when God talks about our losing ourselves, he means only abandoning the clamor of our self-will. Once that's done, he gives back all of our personality when they become wholly his and can be used to move forward with his purpose. What does it mean to wrestle with an angel? Most specifically, it refers to God's overt actions to bring us to reformation and transformation. We can resist and stubbornly hold on to our ways of doing it ourselves, or we can take hold of God and not let go until he grants a blessing to us. We have to be determined to let him work his transforming power in our lives. You know, one thing I'd heard back to early on in my marriage to my wife Angie, we had premarital counseling, and one thing he told us, and it's probably a truism, is that when you marry someone, you take them as they are. You don't change them. If you start to want to change your spouse, I learned that early on as well as the crunchy lasagna that doesn't work. It doesn't work to try to change your spouse. And, that's so true in marriage. However, God, his relationship with us is such that he loves us, but guess what? He doesn't want to marry us. By that I mean that God loves us, but he wants to change us. He loves you just the way you are, but he loves you too much to leave you the way you are. In order to be used by him, we've got to be changed. Like Jacob, sometimes we don't want to change. We wrestle with God, refusing to yield to him. We just want to I want to hang on to my bitterness, my pride, my arrogance, expecting God to change for me to do my bidding and my saying the same. In wrestling with God, Jacob began to see himself from God's perspective. Rather than a shrewd and cunning deal maker, he came face to face with the fact that he was completely inadequate. His self-sufficiency that seemed to advance him into wealth and prosperity in a large family was not what advanced him. It was God's grace and God's mercy, and he had to embrace that. He had to recognize his need for God in the ruins of the bankruptcy of his self-reliance. The greatest sacrifice Jacob would be asked to make would be of his self-sufficiency, changing his name from usurper, that one who grabs the heel, that one who trips up his opponent, to allowing God to fight for him. Our wrestling with God is ultimately not about admonishing God about our grievances, about what he needs to do for us. It's rather recognizing our desire. We cannot treat God as a commodity. We must struggle to see ourselves from God's perspective and yielding, sacrificing the things that are blocking us from his purposes to provide blessing and shalom and peace to the world around us. We're called to transformation experience in community. When Jesus began his earthly ministry, he called 12 disciples, and he had even an inner group of 3 that he really spent time with. He developed his most profound relationship for his work. The book of Acts also shows the early church was composed of a community that met from house to house. As we go through transformation, we have an opportunity to do that in community. We need other believers to help us know and live the truth of God's word. Small groups are what God uses to transform our character, to help us become more like Christ, to wrestle together to see how God would move us forward as the Holy Spirit matures us spiritually. I'd encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to be in a DNA group and have that experience of community, that QR code will allow you to get more information about that. But it is God who continues to wrestle with us, to transform us, that he is committed to loving us, but then changing us as well. And as we do that, we experience the blessing of God in our lives, not because of who we are and what we've done, but because of who he is and what he has done. So can I ask you just to consider, how would God speak to you to have you continue to seek after him for his purposes of blessing you and blessing the world as you submit to what his plans are for you, as you're wrestling to see, God, what direction would you have me go? How would you have me live? Thank you for considering that.